Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight, Regan and myself will be reporting back from our solidarity mission to Israel during this time of war. We will be reflecting on what we've seen, in particular visiting the south of Israel and a kibbutz near Oz that was destroyed by Hamas on October the 7th. We'll also be discussing the car park that is currently storing 1,300 cars. Many of them are burnt, others that have been shot to bits by Hamas on October the 7th. We'll be reflecting upon our visit to the heart of Israel's democracy, that is the Knesset, and also our visit to the north of Israel, right up on the border between Israel and Lebanon, and just really engaging what God is doing in the land of Israel right now as Israel is at war. Regan, it's great to have had 5 incredible days with you in Israel, sponsored by the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, UK, for their solidarity mission for pastors and ministry leaders to spend time in Israel to understand exactly what's happening in Israel post October the 7th.
Throughout the scriptures, Simon, we do see this precedent of going and seeing for oneself and bringing back a clear and confident first-hand report. And so deep gratitude to yourself, to Revelation TV, to ICEJUK UK for allowing this to take place and facilitating it. It was truly a stirring time, a time that will remain deeply embedded, I think, in our minds. The harrowing stories that were heard, but I think what stands out particularly to me is the nature of the approach to the horrors that were experienced on the 7th of October by the victims. There's a strength, there's a poise, there's a dignity, there's a hope, and there's a confidence of full and final victory. And that radiated from everyone. We spoke with hostage families, we spoke with people who had lost loved ones. Rabbi Shmuel Bowman, who we spent a good few hours with on the bus last week, spoke of how he lost 12 close friends and how 2 are hostages. And yet you're talking in a way that shows that you have a measure of peace, that you have a measure of confidence and hope, even in the most soul-shaking trauma.
I mean, I was apprehensive about going. I think you're aware of that. Not for the reasons for my own personal safety or fear that we were going close to a war zone, or the fact that we could see literally a war start between Israel and Hezbollah in the north, or being down in the south and then coming under a rocket attack from Hamas. My major concern was, and my major apprehension was, the fact that, am I going to see a different Israel than the one I've experienced before? And having so many incredible memories out there, I didn't want to go to a nation that I thought would be broken and changed, a nation in sorrow and mourning. But once you're there, it's like incredible to actually, I mean, we both took personal risks in going because we could have no travel insurance. Yeah, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office put out an apocalyptic warning telling us don't, and I think we did all of them in our visit to Israel. And so therefore the only planes flying or carriers flying to Israel was Al Al, direct flights to Israel, no British Airways, no budget airlines, no Virgin Atlantic. The only flights flying to Israel was Al Al. And when we were actually there, to be in the land was incredible. I mean, firstly, the resilience of the Israeli people was astonishing. They're patriotic, they're rallying around the flags. And I've been to Israel so many times, even during Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is Israel's Independence Day. I've never seen so many Israeli flags flying. Yeah, just incredible.
Yeah, it's true. Granted, I've never seen Jerusalem so subdued. I've never seen people as somber in Israel, yet at the same time, there definitely is that sense of resolve, unity, which was not experienced last year, Simon. We've done programs on what some were saying was the brink of civil war in the land, as there was so much disagreement, so many protests over judicial reforms last year. None of that, all of that's faded into the distance. We heard people speak of their dissatisfaction and distrust, how there's been breaches of confidence between the general populace and the army and the government, but how ultimately at this moment in time, there's a recognition that unity is a necessity. And so regardless of these other issues that may remain, that may be there, they're working forward to resolving those issues and seeing the common enemy defeated.
Absolutely. So thanks to the International Christian Embassy at Jerusalem, UK for sponsoring us to go to Israel. And without them, we couldn't have been. So a big thank you to our friends at ICEJUK. What was also interesting is that the International Christian Embassy at Jerusalem were holding their solidarity mission. So they had 70 pastors and ministry leaders from 18 different nations attending the N Vision conference in Jerusalem, to stand in solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people. But what struck me, I think, Regan, is because I met you on the Sunday the 28th of January at Heathrow, and we met in the kind of departures area of the terminal once you get through security and passport control and everything else. And then we shared a flight together. And what was interesting as well, that the vast majority of those on the flights were from the ultra-Orthodox community. Yep. I even sat down to a lovely father and his daughter going out there for 4 days to visit family as well. And he was incredibly open. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox community are a very close shop. So the fact that he was asking me questions, why are you in Israel? Who are you visiting? What do you do? So I was able to tell him that, we as a Christian station, Revelation TV, love Israel and the Jewish people, and that's why we're going there. And I produce and present programs about Israel and the Middle East. He was fascinated and said, I want your card. So I gave him my business card, and he said, I will definitely watch your programs. And so quite an amazing situation is he had a lovely little 6-7-year-old daughter next to him as well. Fantastic. So just amazing openness at the start. And then when we got through passport control, you nearly got taken back to the UK on the next flight with a visa problem. I had to kind of wait for you to get through security. But it was very touching to see and very moving. As soon as you, and anyone who knows Ben Gurion Airport, as soon as you go towards passport control, you've got that long corridor that slopes down, and you've got the kind of equivalent of the Western Wall with all the photographs of Israel up there. And as we were walking down, we saw all the faces of the remaining Israeli hostages, and that was very moving. It just makes just go in there and you instantly kind of understand what the Israelis are going through, and their whole one objective, I think more important than winning the war against Hamas, is getting the hostages back.
That's the primary goal at this point in time. People are, of course, concerned that Hamas is defeated, but the priority has been and must remain that the hostages are returned home. That's why, Simon, there have been deals that have been made previously. You see the value with which Israel has for its hostages, that they're even willing to give up. They were giving up 2 terrorists per 1 hostage back in November, and there was some concern that was expressed by some over that, but most recognized, no, we need to get these back. We need the hostages back. Other deals Israel has sought to make, even for fairly lengthy ceasefire periods, considering the gravity of the situation and what's happened. Hamas has refused to, time and again. Not just at the airport did we see those images, they were constantly embedded in our minds as every single place we went. We had massive banners outside hotels showing all of the hostages' faces, outside of banks, in the streets. The posters that some of us have seen in London and other cities around the world that show the faces and details of those who were abducted and taken into captivity. those faces are there in front of everyone every day as a reminder of what it is that Israel must fight for. And any discussion of progression of talks or any discussion of a ceasefire must always be preceded by discussion of the, without exception, return of these hostages.
No, absolutely. And we arrived in Jerusalem in the probably about 6 or 6:30 a.m. on Monday, the 29th of January. Because it was a night flight, I caught up on sleep, but Regan went to the gym and then met up with his family, his in-laws in Jerusalem. But I did go for a walk from where our hotel was. It was at the Leonardo Hotel, which borders essentially West Jerusalem. You're very, very close to the beautiful Garden Tomb that was closed. And I do remember walking through the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem and past the Garden Tomb, past the Damascus Gate. There weren't that many people around because it's an hour quarter, but always kind of watching my back, always looking around to see who was there, who was around me and stuff as well. And it was great to then go into a bit of the old city. I only got as far as the Jaffa Gate. I would have loved to have gone to the Hakkat al-Hamaravi, the Western Wall, but time didn't permit. Because we're attending what's known as the government press office. And this was a stellar cast that they put on for us at the Christian Friends of Zion Museum in downtown Jerusalem. So the government press office is the media wing of the Prime Minister's office, and effectively they give journalists from around the world visas to report on Israel, and plus they provide a lot of content as well. And since 2017, they have organised what's known as the Christian Media Summit for broadcasters and journalists who are Christians from all over the world to gather together in Jerusalem, and it's been a privilege to be part of that. But to understand the incredible work that the GPO is doing in defending Israel and telling Israel's narrative, let's take a look and see what they do.
I didn't know this kind of stuff. How they make it such cruel things, and how the human being become like this for another human being.
It was something very cruel. It was something very brutal. I felt disgusting.
Challenge remains a challenge it has always been. We are better than our enemy. We will not do what our enemy does.
הטבח שהיה כאן בכפר עזה ב7 באוקטובר היה אחד הימים הקשים מאז פרוץ הקרבות. עשרות הרוגים, עשרות חטופים ונעדר אחד. האתגר שלנו בלשכת העיתונות הממשלתית ומערך ההסברה הלאומי להשאיר את העיתונאים הזרים כאן, ביישובי העוטף, שיראו את הזוועות שהיו כאן ולא יעברו לצד השני.
It's really fantastic work being done by the GPO, the Government Press Office there, and we were very privileged to be able to attend a special press briefing that occurred on the 29th of January. That was sponsored by Nitzan He, the GPO director, Dr. Mike Evans. We had a video message welcoming us from President Isaac Herzog, Brigadier General Gal Hirsch, hostage negotiator as well, spoke to us, IDF spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hett, Elian Levy, who is essentially the spokesperson for the government at the moment, Chris Mitchell of CBN News, very familiar face, Joel Rosenberg, Yoni Asher, a family member held hostage in Gaza, Afri Bibas, whose brother, sister-in-law, and two nephews are still being held in Gaza. The face of the two young children, particularly Kfir Bibas, I believe, just turned 1 year old while in captivity. He's still alive.
I'm not forgetting our good friend Hugh Kitson, who watched it via Zoom. You can see him in the top right-hand corner. So it was great to see Hugh there. There we go. And also the fact as well that we also had the father of the first sergeant. His name is Gideon Bayer, who is German. And his father went to visit Israel in the 1980s and set up a nursing care home for Holocaust survivors. And Gideon's son was born in Israel and so therefore served in the IDF, and sadly he was killed fighting with the IDF in Gaza. I mean, what an incredible legacy to know that the Germans over 80 years ago were fighting in the Second World War against the Allies, but also responsible for the Holocaust. And here we have a German soldier who was a Christian fighting and standing in solidarity with his brothers in arms in the IDF.
And he technically didn't even have to serve in the IDF. This was one of the most powerful elements of the testimony, I felt, was where the reality is, because he's not Jewish, because he is yes, Israeli, but German, Israeli and Christian, there's no obligation for him to serve in the IDF. However, that's not how he viewed it. He recognized the important role the IDF had played in protecting even his family in wars past. This is, we have to remember, a recurring situation to some degree, and just as he was protected as a child by the IDF, he felt it was his moral obligation and responsibility to bear arms alongside the IDF, and he bravely gave his life.
Let's have a look now at the GPO press briefing that Regan and myself attended, and this is highlights from the evening courtesy of our friends at the Government Press Office.
מלחמת חרבות ברזל זכתה לסיקור נרחב בכלי התקשורת הגדולים בעולם. כעת הפיקה לשכת העיתונות הממשלתית כנס מיוחד הבוחן את האופן בו סוקרה המלחמה מבחוץ.
The meeting today, it was important because you had here media coverage from different countries. The media is a very powerful tool, and by even one video, one interview, millions of people can see it in the same time. And then the story, it's multiplied again and again. This is the reason that the story of all the hostages are known almost all over the world.
Every night, every day, 24/7, since the beginning of the war. Even when I close my eyes, I see 136 faces.
I'm running a news agency covering Israel and the Middle East for more than 2 decades, and I think it's extremely important to tell the stories of what happened on October 7th. It's critical to teach the world the facts of what has happened, hear the stories of the hostages, their families, those that fell, those that are still in hostage in Gaza.
The people, the media, the governments, the leaders needs to understand that each minute is critical.
I was very interested to meet the family of the hostages. I've read the stories, I've seen the stories on TV. A testimony of family, of witnesses, you cannot ignore it. And it's very impressive and almost surrealistic to see them in front of you. I want to be a witness of the stories. I want to be a witness of what's happening here and to show the world what's happening here.
As a journalist, there's a responsibility to tell the world the whole picture and nothing but it. So being here is part of just showing up and telling the story, and that's what the world needs.
Our Father in heaven, in Jerusalem, we stand united. Return our love once so brutally taken Gaza. May them return him strong in body and mind. Amen.
Well, again, it was an immensely important evening, and I do believe that these sorts of events are critical to informing and also shaping how the media is presenting what's going on. Hearing from the members of hostage families, incredibly powerful, and it was impossible not to be moved as we heard very powerful testimonies from them. Now, the very next day we moved swiftly down to the south, and we actually, Simon, were able to go onto one of the kibbutzim that was destroyed. Prior to that, driving past the site of the Nova Festival, other places as well we encountered along the way.
Yeah, but first we visited the Sderot Negev Regional Council, and this is the headquarters of the Eshkol Regional Council there that oversees and governs that whole area of southern Israel that was attacked by Hamas in the worst terrorist attack in Israel's history back on the 7th of October. And what was quite amazing is that the ICEJ donated 113 Motorola radio transmitters, which enabled the emergency response team in the regions to send instant encrypted multi-party alerts, because what we don't know about what happened on October the 7th was that the mobile phone system went down. So people who were Israelis and others who were under attack on October the 7th couldn't communicate with loved ones because their mobile phone signal and their phones went down, whether that was deliberately done by Hamas to jam the system or whether because the vast majority of calls being made on mobile phones then just completely overran the mobile phone signal. I don't know. But I think what's imperative is that, for example, the security guards at each kibbutzes and each town in that area in close proximity to Gaza were able to communicate.
And there was a very chilling story that was told by the security chief, Rafi Babian, that we heard. And he recounted for our group his valiant efforts in seeking to lead some 30 vehicles, 42 vehicles initially, filled with civilians through open fields to safety on October the 7th. I'll never forget his words. He said there were 42 vehicles that he was trying to get to follow him, but quite a few were hesitant and wondering what they should do, whether they should follow or not. He said, look, I am the security chief for this region. Follow me if you want to save your lives. 30 did follow him. The next day, he retraced steps and went back, and the remaining 12 vehicles had all been gunned down, and the bodies of the civilians there were either in the cars or were strewn in the road around. And he said with a real degree of sadness how much he thinks about how he wishes he could have convinced those other 12 cars to follow him, but how a wise man has told him, no, but think about the 30 that you saved. And really incredible stories of heroism, tragedy. Often sees these heroes rise to the surface, and Rafi Babian is definitely one of those heroes.
No, absolutely. And also from there we actually then visited kibbutz Nir Oz, but before we did, we're on the coach and we went past the site of the Nova Music Festival where 340 young Israelis not only were murdered in cold blood, but many of the women were raped and mutilated in the most vile, disgusting, evil manner by Hamas on the 7th of October. I mean, the one thing that also struck me about being in Israel, Regan, particularly in the south, I've never seen Israel so green. They had so much rainfall, and so the site of the Nova Music Festival, when we went past the major where the stage was for the music festival, it was incredibly green. It had a chilling sense of peace to it. But I don't think anything prepared me for what we saw later, because our next stop was at the car park called Te Ku'am, which was a car park filled with 1,300 damaged and burnt out cars. And this is literally 1,300 cars that were shot up by Hamas on October the 7th are parked here. And this is just one of 3 major car parks. And in one of the shots you saw there was a huge billow of smoke. While we were there, we heard explosions go off in Gaza, and right where that smoke is in the background, that's Gaza. So we were so close to Gaza, and I literally picked up, which I'm going to show you now, kind of dark souvenir, but this was a sniper's bullet used by Hamas on October the 7th. I wanted to bring this back, particularly for those so-called Christians who don't believe that October the 7th happened, and it was literally like visiting the site of a Holocaust taking place, or a pogrom taking place. And there we see there in this picture, this was the pickup truck used by Hamas, and those were the motorbikes used by Hamas on October the 7th. And what struck me, I think, when we entered that car park, and we were very privileged to actually have gone there, it was only open to ICEJ because of their close connections with the Eshkol Regional Council and the Negev Council, and their close relationships in helping to provide bomb shelters and to date parks, that we were actually able to visit this site. Usually this site is out of bounds for anyone, but to see the magnitude of what happened on October the 7th was horrific. And I think really that this does resonate around the world, because if you're a driver and you know what it's like to drive a car, so therefore you can just imagine yourself being in one of those cars, driving on October the 7th, and literally being shot in cold blood by Hamas. And that's what we saw. But also the fact is as well, we see here, for example, these were the cars that were burnt out. And I was speaking to the security guide that we have, and he said that Hamas used this incredibly inflammable liquid. Normally cars would only burn for 2 or 3 hours, but this inflammable liquid meant that those cars burnt for anything between 12 and 13 hours with the people inside. And this is and they got this from the Iranians who smuggled in. And one thing I learned about this as well, we very much put the blame for October the 7th on Hamas, and particularly Hamas's paymasters, the Iranian regime, and the Ayatollahs in Iran. But also the fact we have to acknowledge that so many of the weapons that were used on October the 7th came through the Rafah crossing from Egypt into Gaza. So therefore the Egyptian government has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, very definitely, and we see their complicity, culpability across so many of the Arab nations. There's definitely been a sense of a lack of moral clarity in official statements that have been given. There was very little said in regards to the events of October the 7th by way of condemnation. If anything was said, generally it was on the defensive and was couching things in terms of resistance, but very little mention of the fact that these are defenseless civilians. Most of the individuals who were affected in this region that we visited were peace-loving people, even activists, peace activists, campaigners. This festival, the music festival, was called a peace festival. any security that was there. I was talking with a few of the people myself who they said that the security was not heavily armed. They would have had some handguns, but pretty much nothing else. And the whole idea of having anything heavier was just, it wasn't really on their radar. It seemed counterproductive to have a peace festival that was heavily armed. They knew that this was an area that could be affected by rocket fire, but one of the things that we heard time and again was no one expected this. No one expected a ground invasion. That was completely out of people's minds. Okay, rocket fire here and there. A ground invasion of this type of success that had numbers vary, but anywhere between 2,500 to 5,000 terrorists infiltrating.
No, that's more than that, because that
was the number that was given.
We were told now, the evidence is coming out now, that there was at the time around 3,000 Hamas terrorists. Now that number seems to have gone up to 5,000 terrorists, Hamas terrorists, who carried out the massacre, the pogrom, the Holocaust on October the 7th. The fact is that Hamas took over between 22 and 26 different locations in Israel. Really kind of indicates the scale of this, and seeing all those cars, and the majority of the cars you've seen in those pictures come from the Nova Music Festival and those who attended that all-night party and rave. And you can see there, look very, very closely, and you'll see the machine gun bullets into the cars. So they shot the windows where the drivers were, they shot the engines of the cars, but what you also see is they shot the tires, disabling the car. And what was so horrific is once you looked inside of these cars, I was particularly moved when I saw one car that it was like in Israelis just going for a picnic. They had their picnic bags packed, they had beach mats, and there were children's books on the back seat of the car. And all that this Israeli family were doing was going out for a family day out to the beach, to have a picnic at the beach. And they were murdered by Hamas in the most graphic, horrendous way. Now, there has been an excellent article written, thanks to the Daily Mail, talking about what's happened. So it says, I was in charge of gathering the bodies after the Nova Festival massacre. They were still smouldering 12 hours later. Israeli officials give a devastating account of the sickening scene after October the 7th, Hamas terrorist attack that plunged the world into crisis.
And the reality of what they encountered, the grim reality of the sight and smell of 30 charred bodies still smoldering, as Haim Mezgin pulled up to the site of the Nova Festival on October the 7th, will never leave him. But Haim, a 50-year-old top official of Zaka, a rescue and recovery organization that was tasked with cleaning up the 1,200 killed by Hamas on Black Saturday, in accordance with Jewish customs, had a job to do. And he was in charge of coordinating the response of the deadly attacks, to the deadly attacks, and ensuring that all the bodies were accounted for and treated properly as soon as possible. But the brutality with which Hamas had killed more than 360 innocent partygoers at the Nova Festival shocked even him, a volunteer who had been working for Zaka since he was just 18 years old. Haim, who spoke to Mail Online through a translator, said that there were at least 30 bodies that were burned alive. Many needed to have water poured on them because they were still burning 12 hours after, because of that fuel you were mentioning, Simon, that they used to set them on fire. Their bodies were soaking with this fuel that caused them to burn for a long time. Hamas didn't just use fire as a weapon of war against partygoers at the festival. Sexual violence was used to humiliate the victims at the site.
Just to give you a graphic warning that this is graphic and it's horrific, but you need to hear it.
Most of those who experienced that sort of violence were, of course, young women. He said, when I go back to the memories, I remember lots of bodies were mutilated to pieces. Organs were separated from their bodies. Women had been shot in their very private areas, the upper parts of their legs and their heads. Women were undressed and then they were shot. A few bodies that were hit by rocks in a very barbaric way, in a way that crushed the skull. I saw stab wounds in very specific areas on women. around their genitals. Chaim, who became aware of reports of a Hamas attack early that morning, arrived at the site at 9:30 p.m., saying his role as a leader at Zaka meant he had to prevent these images from affecting him. But it's impossible for them not to affect to some degree the emotional toll.
Absolutely.
Even we heard testimonies from people who were there saying that they really don't think anyone has been able to take a step back to breathe, and that the worst of the mental trauma has even hit yet.
Yeah, but if you think that Zaka, these are the religious authorities in Israel that are always on the scene of a terrorist attack, and in the 90s and in the early 2000s, they were responsible for collecting all the body parts from the suicide bombing. So just imagine what he saw as the head of Zaka and the slaughter by Hamas on October 7th. And this was 360 Israeli partygoers at the Nova Music Festival. Do you want to read on? Because this is a personal, powerful testimony.
He continued and says that he had to become like a machine and was forced to make some incredibly difficult decisions on his way down from his base in Petah Tikva to Kibbutz Re'im. On the way from Petah Tikva to the south, I saw a few civilians waving at my ambulance. I started thinking, I know I need to get south, but maybe in order to prepare for this, I should let myself into this situation slowly and see what these people want to say. I thought they probably want to tell me something in regard to what's going on in the south. So he slowed down and let the civilians who had a car approach him. They said, "We have two of them." I asked them, "What two? What are you talking about?" And they just showed me two dead bodies, young women, both shot in their heads. He had no choice but to take their bodies and continue down to the site of the festival. More and more civilians tried flagging him down as he made his way down with the women's bodies in tow, each one holding a different person slaughtered by Hamas fighters who were still rampaging throughout southern Israel. Chaim said he had to make the very difficult decision to keep going in spite of the horrors he saw.
I mean, it's just absolutely horrific. And yeah, this is what one Israeli officer asked him. He said this one: "How long does it take for a body to rot?" Taken back, Chaim told the officer he needed more details. As the Zaka officer said, he was told, "I have a carpet of dead bodies in the middle of the forest. I don't know what to do with them." Chaim was still unsure what the officer meant, and he asked to speak to him on a video call. It was then, watching a blurred and jumpy video streamed from a smartphone, that Chaim understood the scale of the atrocity. He said the officer told him that he had counted at least 125 bodies, but there were many more that needed to be counted. In the first few hours after he arrived at the site of the Nova Festival, and we do have pictures of the Nova Festival to show you now, which is the whole area of green, which was just an empty field essentially, but now we still have Israeli forensic investigators there even to this day. Told him that he had counted at least 125 bodies and that were there many more that need to be counted. Said in the 4 hours after he arrived at the site of the Nova massacre, his team had to be clear as many bodies in line with Jewish customs as possible. He said Zaka was able to clear 237 bodies in just a few hours, while still under fire from Hamas rockets and guns. But with dozens more bodies at the Nova Festival site alone, and hundreds more across Israel, Chaim said his physical health took a toll as he carried on his work. He said, "I didn't stop working for 60 days. I was getting 4 hours of sleep a night, and I lost 9 kilograms in 2 months because I didn't have time to eat." It wasn't only his physical health that suffered. And what we saw was the magnitude, the sheer magnitude of what happened on October the 7th is beyond comprehension. And until you go and visit, like we did, the car park close to the kibbutzes of where this all happened, or kibbutz near Oz, you won't believe the magnitude and the scale of this terrorist attack, which was the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history. Not only that, the same number of people, around, 1,200 Israelis were murdered on that day, and also foreigners as well, who were working in Israel were murdered on that day, about the equivalent of those who were murdered during the Second Intifada from 2000 to about 2004.
And as we were going down on our journey to the south, we eventually arrived at kibbutz Nir Oz, which was one of the early sites attacked there. Well, we passed by the Nova Festival site where over 340 people were murdered. Here at Nir Oz, a quarter of its population faced itself being either massacred or taken into captivity as hostages. I believe there was about 400 civilians at this relatively small kibbutz, 220 houses. All but 6 of those houses had been entered, ransacked, and burned to the ground. This is a picture of what remains of the home of a man who suffered from dementia, disabled. His walker is still there, its charred remains still there, and he was found on his blood-stained sofa in what was meant to be a safe room where he, disabled and elderly, had been brutalized by Hamas terrorists. And this same story continued. House to house we were taken, spot to spot. We saw Simon is one of the most beautiful places I've seen in terms of communities. The gardens were beautiful, unique. One of the founders was a collector, and he had these unique cactuses that he was growing and other ornaments that were littered around his garden. But in the midst of such beauty, such devastation, every single house.
What was chilling for me in particular visiting kibbutz Nir Oz, as we approached there, I saw the road in which we showed after October the 7th, the Hamas shooting up the cars and the Israeli cars coming to end this video here, and actually being on this street was so eerie. And then I saw a signpost just after this saying kibbutz Narim. Now, I visited kibbutz Narim in December 2022 as part of the Christian Media Summit organised by the Government Press Office, and knowing how close that was to kibbutz Nir Oz and kibbutz Be'eri was chilling, because these are beautiful kibbutzes. They are absolutely beautiful, and having spent 3 months on a kibbutz with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, it was just shocking for me to see what we saw at kibbutz Nir Oz. And it must have been absolutely frightening for the residents of kibbutz Nir Oz and kibbutz Be'eri and other kibbutzes to find themselves on what I can only describe as almost a 19th century pogrom. And it was a site of a pogrom, it was a massacre, and it reminded me something of the Holocaust. There we see some of the pictures of the hostages, and this is their homes of where they lived and how they are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. And what we see there is a writing on the wall. So the Israeli investigators, who are part of their forensic investigative unit, would actually then carry out investigations on those particular homes, and you see the dates of when it was completed. Depending on the writing would also depend on the severity of the crimes committed by Hamas on October the 7th and the magnitude, levels of violence and torture and brutality. And here we can see Regan took this with his phone actually inside one of these homes.
This is the home of that gentleman I was speaking of, who was disabled and suffering from dementia, who was murdered. They found his body there on the sofa after he had been killed by Hamas terrorists. And one of the most powerful moments as we went through Nir Oz was finding ourselves at the very last house. For me personally, having gone to Downing Street 2 days after for a vigil outside, I was given a poster by an elderly lady who just overcome with exhaustion and emotion. She sat down in the middle of the pavement, and she gave me this poster and asked if I would hold it up for her. And it had the picture of this grandmother, Carmela, and her granddaughter, Noya, who many will remember those names. Noya suffered from autism And we suddenly find ourselves in this broken, destroyed, dilapidated, burnt out shell of their home. They had been taken as hostages. It's believed probably that Noya had potentially a fit of some kind related to her autism, and they were just disposed of and gunned down on the Gaza border, where their desecrated bodies were found some days later.
And also what was interesting being at Kibbutz Nir Oz, don't forget, you need to realize this, that we were about a mile away from the Gaza Strip. So we see all the smoke from Gaza, and we'd hear Israeli artillery going off, like big booms from their artillery guns going off into Gaza, and suddenly you feel the ground shake, like boom, boom kind of noise. And that was the closest I've ever been to a kind of war zone. Knowing that the IDF are fighting courageously against these evil, vile terrorists who are Hamas, who are a genocidal terrorist organization, and the crimes that they committed were worse than the crimes that the Nazis committed. Can you believe that? In the Second World War. And that's why Israel is justified in destroying Hamas, because Israel's very survival as a nation state is under threat if she doesn't. And let's remember that Israel's a democracy. You have freedom of press, you have freedom of religion, you have the institutions of democracy, a free judiciary, an elected government. There is freedom of worship, and there is not anywhere else like that anywhere else in the Middle East. And certainly if you're a Christian in Gaza, you're going to be persecuted, unlike Israel. But I think one of the highlights for me, I mean, that was horrific seeing Kibbutz Nir Oz, but one of the highlights for me, Regan, was visiting Kibbutz Mefasalim, where, this is according to my notes here, Christian leaders shared a cookout, well, I call it a barbecue, really nice steak there, as well as nice cooked sausages and grilled chicken, with local emergency teams, and received a briefing from the kibbutz security officers on how they managed to fend off at least 30 terrorists that day on October the 7th. I mean, for me, it was great for me to be able to talk to the IDF soldiers, and one guy I talked to was a big kind of Manchester United fan, asking me what I was doing in Israel, and just to be able to shake their hands and say, well done guys, you're doing a good job, we're standing with you, and we're standing you in this fight against this evil genocidal terrorist organisation that is Hamas. And I make no apology for that, because that's exactly what Hamas is, and their evidence is clear from October the 7th.
What was incredible about that particular kibbutz is it also had an attempted infiltration by Hamas on the 7th of October, but they were able to successfully defend that kibbutz against any infiltration. And while there were terrorists who made it through the gates, eventually their volunteer security team made up of civilians was able to eliminate the threat quite swiftly.
And what was a miracle as well was that their gate wasn't working. So the front gate, the front yellow gate to the kibbutz, wasn't working properly and was open. So many of the Hamas terrorists on that day thought that the Hamas terrorists had already gone into that kibbutz and actually destroyed it, which then caught a lot of the Hamas terrorists off guard. And literally, some of these volunteer fighters were able to ward off over 30 Hamas terrorist attackers on their kibbutz, preserving so many different lives. But the one thing which really impressed me about being there was this resilience. Let's also remember that over 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated from the north. Is it about 150,000 or that sort of region from the south evacuated? And they've been put up in homes in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem. But there's this longing to go home, to go back to those kibbutzes that were destroyed on October the 7th, and to rebuild stronger. And it just feels like, yep, this is a horrific chapter in our history. We will remember it, but we move on. We are not going to be cowered into defeat. And that attitude, I think, kind of really impressed me when I was there, as well as seeing the soldiers and stuff as well. But we, the next day, Regan, we went to the Knesset to show solidarity with Israeli members of the Knesset. We were also addressed by Israel's Minister of the Intelligence as well. There you go, you're outside of the Knesset. Share with us what your first experience of being in the Knesset was.
This was the first time I visited the Knesset, and one of the things that I found immensely impactful was the biblical symbols that we have throughout the government building. And no government building at any other place have I seen such rich biblical imagery and art, and the incredible tapestries that hang in the main hall as you enter, and throughout real openness and transparency. This was something that they emphasized as we were shown around by our host, how any questions you have, anything you desire to see or desire to know, there's complete transparency. You can access all of the sessions unless it's directly related to defense and national security for obvious reasons. You can book in to sit on any of the committees. You can observe any of the Knesset sessions. Really, really incredible. But a reminder of the declaration, essentially, of Israel's independence, and its forming a constitution is there, which indicates unequivocally that it is a state, a Jewish state, that is committed to equal rights and opportunities for all, regardless of who they are or where they come from, going completely against this common narrative of apartheid and opposition. There's no essence of that in the legal system.
Yeah. So can we go back to that photo we showed of the actual Knesset, because there's an important, this is the actual debating chamber of the Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset. Now, if you look very carefully, it's shaped in the actual national symbol of Israel, which is the menorah. And there we go. You'd have the Speaker of the House behind the big Israeli flag, and the Prime Minister would either sit on one of those seats next to the Speaker of the House. So that is the makeup of the Israeli parliament. It was quite quiet that day. I don't think there was much going on. There you go. There's me outside the Knesset as well.
Across the chairs that are there in the viewing gallery, quite poignant posters of the remaining hostages who their whereabouts are unknown. If they're alive, it's unknown by this stage. We're over 120 days after, but they have those posters that are there to indicate that they, while not in Israel, are being at the core of the Knesset's considerations as it meets. So it was a really powerful time to be able to hear also from, again, a hostage mother who's there, who gave us an incredible speech, Rachel Goldberg. Very amazing to see the poise and the dignity. We're able to hear a great deal of ongoing efforts that are operating on an internal way, and a powerful speech by the ICEJ leader, Dr. Regan, who reminded us of the urgency of Christians standing with Israel.
Absolutely. So since we're coming to the end of the program, we've got lots more to share about our solidarity mission to Israel, and that will have to wait until next week, because we did hear from the hostages. We heard also from a pastor that pastors a Messianic fellowship, I think is in Ashdod, who you got on very well with, Regan. He shared some remarkable stories of miracles that took place on October the 7th, and also how the Messianic congregation in Israel is responding to October the 7th attacks. And of course, then we visited the no-go zone area, which was the north of Israel, which goes against the Foreign Office and Commonwealth warning not to visit the north. Over 100,000 Israelis have been evacuated, and we went in solidarity with a community up there that's actually shielded by the hills from any Hezbollah snipers or rockets as well. So we're going to share more of that next week, and much more of our reflections. But you know, I've never been to Israel during a time of war, but I was impressed by the openness and the hearts of the Israeli people after what they've been through on October the 7th, their sense of patriotism, their sense of I'm trying to look for the word now, their sense of
courage and dignity,
unity, and after what happened on October 7th, it's so easy for other nations could have collapsed. Other societies could have collapsed after October the 7th and given up. But no, their resilience, but there is an awakening, I think, in the hearts of the Israeli people. There is an awakening to who they are as Jewish people and the call of God on their lives. And after all, the Jewish people have given us our morality. They've given us the 10 Commandments. They've given us the Bible. The whole Western foundation is built upon the Jewish people, and they are an integral part of our Judeo-Christian heritage.
And it's critical, Simon, as such, that we continue to recognize that we continue to stand in solidarity with the Jewish people, with Israel, and that we continue to call the horrors of October the 7th for what they are, attacks of terror by a medieval Islamist cult group that desires the complete eradication of the Jews, and also, as we heard on the trip, Christians eventually are next as well. So more clarity is demanded in this time.
So Regan, it was a pleasure doing this program and a pleasure to be with you in Israel. And I want to thank you for watching this program today. This is part 1, and we'll be sharing more about our solidarity visit to Israel next week. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind Headlines.